Today I'm building a floating console like you've never seen before, complete with some unnecessary but very cool details, a bit of chemistry magic to bring it all to life, and yes, a couple of struggles along the way. One of my clients needed a console table for a small mudroom nook that could serve as a visual anchor of sorts near their powder room to hold personal items. The designer, the client, and I, after a few iterations, decided on a floating console which would give us a cleaner look, but then came a great idea. What if we added a subtle recess at the top to visually frame it, add depth, and keep small items from rolling off? Now, if you've watched one of my previous videos, you know I did something similar to a bench. The challenge here was that it needed to be really clean and delicate, with much narrower edges. But I'm always excited for a challenge and went for it. After milling the boards for the top, I was ready for glue up. I normally like to use some sort of alignment aid to ensure I get the best results possible, and in this case I'm using panel clamps. I did not want to use Domino's, biscuits, or Dowels because I was going to remove some material from the top, and there's nothing worse than one of those things making a surprise appearance later on in the build. But for the bottom panel, I am using Domino's. There's no material removal in this case, and my panel clamps were already being used. Now, there's no strength added here, and they're not necessary at all. It's just something I like to do to make things more predictable. With the top and the bottom in clamps, it was time to start making the sides and the center dividers for the case. Now, you do not need your dog to come over and help you set up your jointer, but I highly recommend it. Anyways, for these parts, I built up 4 quarter boards and set up a stop block in my miter saw and cut 3 short pieces per panel. I got some questions on a previous video about why I use short boards vertically versus one longer board horizontally, and the simple explanation is that you don't want the grain on the side panel be oriented in a different direction than the top. That is a recipe for disaster, and even if things don't explode, any movement will make your drawer reviews look really sloppy. Once the top was out of clamps and ripped front and back, I had to square off the first side. For that, you really need a circular saw or a track saw with a square guide. Something that's perfectly square to your fresh edge, since that then becomes a reference for the other side. I use this TSO square with my track saw. This thing is so precise and convenient that a lot of folks completely let go of their table saw in favor of it. Don't get me wrong, I still love my table saw, but the track saw with a square are indispensable in my workflow. Okay, what you see me doing here is marking the top to know where the recess will be. You'll see what I mean soon, but I needed some sort of a template that will be used to route the top. That will also give me a line that I'll use to cross-cut the other side. You might be wondering why I didn't just cross-cut both sides at once to the final length of the top, but the reality is that if I had all dimensions already finalized, you would have made my life a lot more difficult later on. Again, you'll see why in a moment. Like I mentioned earlier, I'd done big pockets like this before, but this time the lip was only 5/16 of an inch, which meant there wasn't much room to secure a template. So I used a much wider plywood guide secured with double-sided tape. That's the reason why I kept the top oversized. I hope that makes sense now. Once the template was secure, I set the depth of cut using a setup block and started routing the perimeter of the top using a patterned router bit in my router sled. And at the end, I ensured that there was a little room for the next bit to enter and clear up the rest of the pocket. For that, I used a bottom clearing bit, but the only one I had on hand was a smaller bit, which took a lot longer and I do not recommend it. I'll add the larger and much better bit that I got after this build from Bits and Bits in the description if you're interested. By the way, I realize this part of the build is not necessarily accessible for everyone. The good news is, if you're interested in building this piece yourself, you can skip this part completely. And the even better news is that I invested a good amount of time to create a set of plans, which I'm super proud of. The plans cover everything you need with the option to build it with or without the recessed top. Okay, now we needed to trim the top to remove the excess we left. For the first cut, I just aligned the track to the line and used my track square to make sure it was all good. To cut the opposite side, I aligned the track to the other line, but this time I set up the stop on my parallel guide to lock on the final length of the top. You'll see why in a minute. The last step was to cut the 2 remaining sides on the table saw. Now, I think this recess is a small detail, but it does make a big difference. If you do want to make this detail, but don't own a router sled, you can easily make one from scrap plywood. There are tons of cheap DIY guides out there. One thing I've learned building higher-end furniture is that thinking ahead really pays off, especially if using reference measurements to get good and clean joinery. I say this because you might be confused as to why I'm finalizing the side dimensions before cutting the bottom. It's all part of the plan and the reason why I keep asking for you to wait and see. Trust me, it will make sense in the end. The next thing I needed to do with the bottom after ripping both sides was to bring it to the exact same length as the top. But wait, remember I told you I set the stop on the parallel guide to lock on that dimension? That's why now I just needed to set the track exactly to that stop, and the good news is no measurement needed. It's the equivalent of having a fence on your table saw locked to cut multiple pieces in the same dimension, except this piece would not fit on my table saw. But the bottom is not finalized yet. Since it's sandwiched between the sides, I had to subtract their combined thickness from the total length. I used the sides to set up my marking gauge, transferred it to the panel and made the cut. Then, wait for it. Perfect fit. I love when that happens. With the top, bottom and sides done, it was time to cut stop dados for the center divider. This can feel intimidating on the table saw, but here's an easy way to do this. First, I set the blade height. Then I run a scrap piece partway through and stop before the blade comes out the back. After the saw is off and the blade stops spinning, I pull the piece back and mark where the cut ends. Then I line the piece back up, transfer that mark to the fence, and now I know exactly where the dado will stop. To cut the first dado, I align the blade, mark where the dado must stop on top of the piece. Then it was as easy as pushing the piece up to the point where both lines meet. And that's it. Friends, I'm not sure if it shows, but I really love sharing what I'm working on and what I've learned, hoping it brings you some kind of value along the way. That said, making these YouTube videos take a lot of time and focus. So, if you're enjoying it or learning something new, a like and subscribe would mean a lot. It helps me and it lets YouTube know it's worth making more of this kind of content. I really appreciate the support. To finalize the dado, I square it off with the chisel. Because this was a stopped dado, the divider will not fit flush with the front of the case, so I needed to cut a notch. So to do that, I measured and transferred the distance between the edge of the cabinet and the front of the divider, and used my Dazuki saw with the Cat's Moses dovetail guide, which I think it's fantastic, by the way. I highly recommend if you don't own one. After a bit of cleanup with the chisel, I tested the fit, and it slid in perfectly. Super satisfying when it comes together like that. Now it's a bit of demonstration of the hip thrust technique that's patented by my good friend Jason Hibbs. The goal here is to join the sides to the top and bottom. As always, dominoes are very handy, but dowels also work great. Now the domino machine is great, but your brain is a mandatory accessory for it. When you don't use it, you cut dominoes in the wrong place like I did here. It's not the first time I did this, and I think it won't be the last. Good news is you can always glue up a domino in place, wait for it to dry, and flush cut it. Like it never happened. And if you do a good job, the parts will fit together and it will give you the first glimpse of the assembled case. And it will also give you the opportunity to address any issues before the glue up. You really don't want to find out things don't fit when you're running against the clock. And speaking of glue ups, I like to pre-sand everything that's difficult to reach when it's all assembled. Well, I don't really like to, nobody does, but I like it way less if I have to squeeze myself into tiny spaces to do it. For the actual glue up, I set the piece on top of 2 scrap pieces because I needed to reach the bottom to add clamps. And at this point I was pretty confident and happy things were working out. But then came adding coils to the center of the case to ensure the divider was sitting correctly. I tried to plan ahead for glue ups, but I did not think through here. Having one of those exercise resistant select stick bend thingies to secure the 2 sides in place would be much easier before I added the clamps. But I got it all done at the end with no casualties except my honor and moved on. Have you ever had a great idea mid-conversation only to realize you just gave yourself more work? I was talking to the designer about the drawers, and I said, hey, I could make the bottoms out of my own roofed sawn veneer to make it look nicer. And she immediately said, you can do that. As I was saying, of course I can. The reality of the amount of work I just signed up for sinked in, but I went for it with a smile on my face. After resawing and sanding all of the individual panels to get the thickness I wanted, I needed to get all the edges perfectly jointed so that they would fit nice when making the panel. For that, I fold them and use a block plane on my Moxon vise, sandwiched between two blocks of plywood. That's the equivalent of running them on my jointer, except with a much smaller risk of tear out. To make each panel, I used green tape to ensure the joints are perfectly aligned, but still flexible enough for me to use glue later on. Then I flip it over and apply glue along the joints, and then come back and spread it with my fingers. Now the next part is something I don't see done very often, which is to place the panels over two pieces of wood like this. What this does is it uses gravity as a way of clamping the joints together, and this works really well. I'll admit veneering is really fun even though it's a lot of work. One reason I don't do this often is because lamination needs to be done right to keep the panels flat. For this project I used a common technique if you don't have a vacuum bag. Start with a flat half-inch MDF base and then waxed 1/8 of an inch hardboard panel to keep glue from sticking. I laid the first veneer tape side down and used hide glue, which doesn't introduce moisture. Then I layered the MDF substrate, applied glue to that, and positioned the other veneer panel on top of that, obviously with the tape side up. And because I'm doing two drawers, I'm using the same contraption and use the same lamination procedure. Quick note on glue type, PVA would probably work since both sides are veneered, but glues for veneering could be a whole video on its own, so I'll leave at that for now. The last layer is another thicker MDF board, which serves as a caul of sorts to distribute clamping pressure. Speaking of which, I just grabbed a bunch of hardware boxes I had laying around and stacked them in the center. And also applied a bunch of clamps around the perimeter of the cauls and hoped it would turn out okay. I left it drying overnight, removed everything, and then, moment of the truth, I think it's awesome. I know what you're thinking. That's cool and all, but couldn't you just have made this bottom out of plywood? And yes, I totally could have. And in fact, that's what I do in most cases. And I do describe the process using plywood in the plans if you want to save time. But if you have the chance to try this out, do it. It's pretty rewarding and it's a great way of expanding your repertoire. The final step was to trim the panels to final dimensions width and lengthwise. For the cross-cut part of it, I like to use a tapering jig to get the first edge straight and square. And after sanding, it looks really clean. Another benefit of doing this is that you don't have to worry about sanding through the super thin veneer if you're using plywood. Okay, with the bottoms done, I needed to construct the rest of the drawer boxes, which I'll fly through because there's not a lot I can add to the 1 billion videos on this subject on YouTube. But I do want to show a couple highlights that made this a bit more special. In general, I use 5/8 of an inch hardwood material, constructed using rabbets, and then add a slot at the bottom to match the thickness of the lamination I made. Other clamps, I prep the bottom to receive undermount slides by cutting the notch at the back. In this case, I'm using a pull saw, a coping saw, and then a flush trim bit on my router. Then I add holes for the hooks on the back and pre-drilled for the clips on the front. Next, I installed the drawer slides, making sure to use the slotted holes where possible to allow for wood movement. And a pause for a couple of satisfying moments, hearing that first click when you install it and the sweet soft close action. The drawer fronts were a special part of this build. I wanted the wood grain to really speak for itself, and I found a long, narrow board with beautifully straight grain. Normally I avoid using sapwood, but this time I decided to glue up the fronts with the sapwood right down the center. You'll see it a little better in a bit, but it gave the piece a really unique and striking look. And as you can probably tell, I made both fronts out of one blank, so I could get a really nice green continuity from left to right. My process to cut them to final dimensions always relies on the actual build case and not on preset measurements. I position the oversized fronts on the upside down case, making sure to add spacers in the bottom. I'm using handy shims which are great for this. Then I make a line on the back side of the fronts, which is exactly where I need to trim it. These shims are also great to position the finalized fronts to secure them in place. I'm using double-sided tape here to temporarily hold them in place so that I can remove the drawers later and sink screws from the back. The last detail on the drawers is something I love doing, which is adding Miller dowels. They are an easy way to add interest to something that's otherwise really boring, while adding significant strength to the box. The last thing I needed to construct was a way to make the floating console, well, float. I'll be using French cleats and an additional back support piece that I can screw in place so it doesn't move when installed. I cut long pieces, made the 45-degree cut, and secured them in place with bucket screws. I was excited about the finish on this piece, but before I could get to that, I needed to square off the internal corners of the lips, final sand it, and add a slight chamfer to all edges using my block plane. I find that this creates a really understated but modern and sophisticated feel to any piece. Finish time. I came across a solution from Rubio Monocoat called Fumed. Don't ask me what it has, but it looks like water, and when you apply, it instantly reacts with the tannins in the wood to darken it and bring out contrast, kind of like a natural aging effect. It's especially great on white oak, where it really highlights the grain without adding pigment. It provides a similar effect as if you used ammonia, but it's completely safe and free from those nasty fumes. The application process is simple. You add a little to a pad of your choice, spread it almost as if you were applying a stain, so always keep an edge to avoid lap lines. And as you can see, the wood reacts almost instantaneously to it, completely transforming it. After 36 hours, I came back with a rag damp with water to neutralize the reaction and let it dry completely. The finish I applied was Rubio Monocoat Oil Plus 2C White, which, together with the fumed, created a really interesting and unique cerused effect that I thought was really beautiful. And just like that, the piece was done, and I have to say I was really proud of it. It is bold but minimal, with a finish that gives the oak so much character. A recessed top that's both beautiful and practical, and that continuous grain on the drawers with a touch of sapwood right in the center. Even the client still brings it up every time we talk. I'd love to know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.